They say a hospital room is the safest place on earth, a sanctuary of healing, white walls and hushed voices. But for 32-year-old Sarah Jenkins, room 402 wasn't a sanctuary. It was a torture chamber. Imagine lying helpless in a hospital bed, 7 months pregnant, unable to run, while the woman destroying your marriage stands over you with a leather belt in her hand. And your husband? He isn't coming to save you. But there was one man who was watching from the shadows. One man who had been underestimated for too long. And when Sarah's father, Thomas, walked through those doors, he didn't just bring help. He brought a vengeance so cold, so calculated, and so unthinkable, it would leave an entire family in ruins. This is the story of how a father's love became a weapon. The rain battered against the reinforced glass of St. Jude's Medical Center, blurring the city lights of Seattle into a smear of grey and neon. Inside room 402, the silence was deafening. It smelled of antiseptic and dying flowers, specifically the wilting lilies Richard had bought 3 days ago, purely for appearances, before disappearing on another business trip. Sarah Jenkins shifted her weight, wincing as the monitors beeped in protest. At 32, she should have been glowing. She should have been painting the nursery or arguing over baby names. Instead, she was strapped to a fetal monitor, confined to strict bed rest due to severe preeclampsia. Her blood pressure was a ticking time bomb, and the stress was the detonator. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. Pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, her blonde hair matted from days of sweating through fevers. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. Her phone buzzed on the tray table. A text from Richard. "Meeting running late. Don't wait up. Love you." Sarah felt a hollow ache in her chest. Richard Jenkins, charming, wealthy, the VP of Sterling Hart Logistics, was a man who could sell ice to an Eskimo. He had sold Sarah a dream of a perfect life in the suburbs. But the reality was a lonely existence in a gilded cage. And lately, the cage had a second keeper. The door to her hospital room didn't just open, it swung wide with an air of entitlement. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, setting off the high-rate alarm on the monitor for a brief second. It wasn't a nurse. It wasn't Richard. It was Jessica Sterling. At 26, Jessica was everything Sarah currently wasn't. Vibrant, dangerous, and dripping in expensive labels. She wore a trench coat that cost more than Sarah's first car, and her red heels clicked aggressively against the linoleum floor. She was the daughter of the CEO of Richard's company. She was the business trip. She was the reason Richard was never home. "Well, well," Jessica purred, closing the door behind her with a definitive click. She didn't lock it, but the weight of her presence filled the room like toxic gas. "Look at you. You look quaint." "Jessica," Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively going to her swollen belly. "What are you doing here? If the nurses see you..." "The nurses are busy with a multi-car pile-up in the ER." "No one is coming, sweetie," Jessica said, walking to the foot of the bed. She picked up Sarah's chart, flipping through it with mock interest. High blood pressure. Risk of seizure. Tisk, tisk. "You're broken, Sarah. Richard needs a woman, not an incubator that's malfunctioning." "Get out," Sarah said, though her voice shook. "I'll call security." Jessica laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. She tossed the chart back onto the bed, hard enough that it hit Sarah's shin. "Call them. Tell them Richard's boss's daughter is visiting. See who they believe. I'm just a concerned friend, checking on the poor, sickly wife." She stepped closer, invading Sarah's personal space. Sarah could smell her perfume, a heavy, musky scent that she had smelled on Richard's shirts for months. It was the scent of betrayal. "Richard is leaving you, you know," Jessica said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's just waiting until the thing comes out. He doesn't want the bad PR of dumping a pregnant wife. But once that baby is born, you're out. The house, the money, the status, it's mine." "He loves me," Sarah lied, tears pricking her eyes. "He's my husband." "He's my pet," Jessica corrected, her eyes flashing with malice. "And frankly, I'm tired of sharing my toys. You're taking too long to let go, Sarah. You're clinging. It's pathetic." Sarah reached for the call button, desperate for anyone to intervene. Jessica's hand shot out, grabbing Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. Her manicured nails dug into Sarah's soft skin, leaving crescent-shaped red marks. "Don't," Jessica warned, her smile vanishing. "I'm not in the mood for noise." Sarah gasped, pulling her arm back, but she was weak from the medication and the bed rest. She was trapped, a prisoner in a room designed to save her life. The atmosphere in the room shifted from uncomfortable to terrified. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the window pane, mirroring the storm brewing inside the private suite. Jessica let go of Sarah's wrist, looking at her own nails as if checking for dirt. Then she began to unbuckle her trench coat. Underneath, she wore a tight black dress, cinched at the waist with a thick designer leather belt. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was heavy, wide, and adorned with a large, silver buckle. "You know what Richard told me last night?" Jessica asked casually, her fingers playing with the buckle. "He said you used to be fun, that you used to have a spark. Now, you're just heavy baggage. Please, Jessica." "My blood pressure," Sarah pleaded, feeling the throbbing in her temples. The monitor was ticking faster now. Beep, 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 beep. "You're hurting the baby." "The baby?" Jessica sneered. "That thing is the only reason he's still tethered to you. If it weren't for that..." She trailed off, her eyes darkening. Slowly, deliberately, Jessica undid the belt around her waist. She pulled it through the loops with a hiss of leather sliding against fabric. She doubled it over in her hand, the leather cracking loudly in the quiet room. Sarah's eyes widened in horror. "What are you doing?" "I'm teaching you a lesson about hierarchy," Jessica said. "You think because you have a ring, you have power. You have nothing. You are nothing." Jessica stepped to the side of the bed. The bed rails were up, but they were low enough for her to reach over. Crack! Jessica snapped the belt against the metal railing, a warning shot that made Sarah flinch so hard she pulled the IV line in her arm. "Please!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was thin, raspy. "Shut up!" Jessica hissed. She swung the belt. It struck Sarah across the upper arm, the leather biting into the exposed skin below her hospital gown sleeve. Sarah cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of shock and pain. The burning sensation was immediate. "Richard isn't coming!" Jessica yelled, swinging again. This time, the belt slap landed on Sarah's thigh, covered only by the thin sheet. "He's at dinner, with my father, discussing our future." Sarah curled into a fetal position, instinctively covering her stomach with her arms and knees. "Stop! Please, the baby! Look at you cowering!" Jessica spat. She was working herself into a frenzy, the jealousy and entitlement boiling over into violence. She struck Sarah's back, the heavy silver buckle grazing Sarah's shoulder blade. Sarah sobbed, the pain radiating through her exhausted body. She felt completely abandoned. The world had shrunk to the stinging slap of leather and the hateful eyes of the woman replacing her. Every strike felt like it was erasing a piece of her humanity. "You will sign the divorce papers the second you are discharged," Jessica commanded, breathing heavily, her face flushed with the exertion of her cruelty. She raised the belt for another strike. "And you will give him full custody. Do you hear me? You aren't fit to be a mother. You can't even protect yourself." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the next blow, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. The monitor was screaming now, a steady, high-pitched alarm indicating her blood pressure was entering a critical zone. Beep, 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 beep. Suddenly the door handle rattled. Jessica froze, the belt raised in mid-air. The door was locked. Jessica must have turned the latch when Sarah wasn't looking. "Sarah? Honey?" It was a voice Sarah hadn't heard in 6 months. It wasn't Richard. It was deeper, rougher, worn down by years of factory work and unfiltered cigarettes. "Dad?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Open this door." Thomas O'Malley's voice boomed from the hallway, muffled by the heavy wood. "I heard a scream! Open the damn door!" Jessica's eyes went wide. She lowered the belt, panic flickering across her face for the first time. She quickly looped the belt back around her waist, fumbling with the buckle, trying to compose herself. "Say a word," Jessica hissed at Sarah, leaning close, her breath hot on Sarah's tear-streaked face. "Say one word about this, and I tell Richard to cut off your health insurance tomorrow. You and this brat will die in a gutter. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded weakly, trembling uncontrollably. She was broken. Jessica smoothed her hair, plastered a fake, concerned smile on her face, and unlocked the door. Thomas O'Malley stood in the doorway. He was a bear of a man, even at 62. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work boots that had seen better days. His face was weathered, carved from granite, but his eyes, usually kind, were currently scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. He looked at Jessica, taking in her flushed face and the slightly askew belt. He looked at Sarah, curling in the bed, sobbing, holding her arm where a red welt was already rising. "Who are you?" Thomas growled, stepping into the room. He didn't move fast, but he took up all the space. "I'm a friend of Richard's," Jessica said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, though her hands were shaking slightly. "Sarah was just having an episode. The hormones, you know. I was trying to calm her down." Thomas didn't look at Jessica. He walked straight to his daughter's side. He saw the red mark on her arm. He saw the terror in her eyes, the kind of terror a daughter should never feel. He gently touched Sarah's hair. "Did she hit you, Sarah?" Sarah looked at Jessica, who was glaring at her from behind Thomas's back, mouthing the word insurance. "No, Dad," Sarah sobbed, lying through her teeth to save her baby. "I fell. I tried to get out of bed, and I fell." Thomas went still. He looked at the bed rails. They were up. It was impossible to fall out of bed with the rails up. He turned slowly to face Jessica. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He just stared at her with a cold, terrifying calm. "You'd best leave," Thomas said quietly, "before I forget that I don't hit women." Jessica scoffed, regaining her composure as she realized Sarah wouldn't rat her out. "Fine, I have better places to be anyway. Richard is waiting." She strutted out of the room, bumping Thomas's shoulder as she passed. Thomas watched her go. He waited until the click of her heels faded down the hallway. Then he looked back at his daughter, his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. He knew she was lying. He knew exactly what was happening. And Thomas O'Malley, the man who had been pushed out of his daughter's life by a snobbish son-in-law, decided right then and there that playing nice was over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old cracked smartphone. He tapped the screen. The recording app was still running. He had started it the moment he heard the yelling from the hallway. He had the sound of the belt. He had the threats. He had it all. "It's okay, Bear," Thomas whispered, using her childhood nickname. "Daddy's here, and I'm going to burn their whole world down." The hours following the incident with the belt dragged on like a slow-motion nightmare. Sarah lay in the dark, the rhythmic whoosh-click of the mechanical blood pressure cuff, the only sound marking the passage of time. Her arm throbbed where the leather had bitten into her skin, a deep purple welt already forming, hidden beneath the sleeve of her gown. But the physical pain was a dull ache compared to the agonizing fear that gripped her heart. Thomas sat in the uncomfortable vinyl recliner in the corner, feigning sleep. His eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even, but his mind was racing at 100 miles an hour. He hadn't left her side. Every time a nurse came in to check Sarah's vitals, Thomas's eyes would slit open, just a fraction, watching like a guard dog. He had the recording. It was saved, backed up to a cloud account his niece had set up for him years ago, and sent to his own email. But a recording wasn't enough. Not against people like Richard Jenkins and Jessica Sterling. They had lawyers who cost more per hour than Thomas made in a month. They could spin this. They could claim it was doctored, or that Jessica was acting in self-defense against a hysterical, pregnant woman. Thomas needed more. He needed to dismantle them. It was 8:00 a.m. when Richard finally arrived. He breezed into the room, carrying a Starbucks cup and a tablet, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of expensive cologne mixed with stale tobacco. He looked fresh, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. There was no guilt in his eyes, only inconvenience. "You're still here?" Richard asked, stopping short when he saw Thomas in the corner. Thomas sat up slowly, stretching his stiff back. "Good morning to you too, Richard." "Yes, I'm still here. Someone has to be." Richard sneered, a subtle curling of his lip that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned his attention to Sarah. He didn't kiss her. He didn't ask how the baby was. He walked to the side of the bed, the side where the bruise was hidden, and tapped the footboard. "I got a call from Jessica," Richard said, his voice devoid of warmth. "She was incredibly upset, Sarah. She told me she came by to bring you flowers and check on you, and you practically attacked her. She said you were screaming like a banshee." Sarah stared at her husband, her mouth slightly agape. The gaslighting was so brazen, so casual. "Richard, she hit me. She had a belt. She threatened to cut off the insurance." Richard sighed, the sound of a patient parent dealing with a toddler. He set his coffee down and rubbed his temples. "Sarah, stop. Just stop. We both know you've been unstable lately. The preeclampsia affects the brain. The doctor said so. Paranoia is a symptom." "I have a bruise, Richard," Sarah cried, reaching for her sleeve. "And Jessica said you fell against the bed rail while trying to lunge at her," Richard cut in smoothly. "Look, I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. Jessica is the daughter of the man who signs my paychecks. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me to get a call from the CEO asking why my wife is harassing his daughter?" Thomas stood up. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. "Harassing," Thomas repeated, his voice low and gravelly. "Is that what they call it now?" Richard turned to his father-in-law, his expression hardening. "Thomas, I appreciate you sitting with her, but this is a private marital matter. I think it's time you went home. You smell like sawdust and old cigarettes. It's not good for the sterile environment." "I'm staying," Thomas said, crossing his arms. "No, you're not," Richard said, pulling a folded envelope from his inner suit jacket pocket. He tossed it onto Sarah's bedside table. "Because Sarah and I have legal matters to discuss. Private matters." Sarah looked at the envelope. "What is that?" "It's a liability waiver," Richard lied smoothly, though his eyes didn't meet hers. And a temporary separation agreement, just until the baby is born. I think we need space. Your behavior toward Jessica was the last straw, Sarah. I can't live with this drama while I'm trying to secure the VP position. I've arranged for you to stay at a specialized care facility after the birth. Better for everyone. You're sending me away? Sarah whispered, tears spilling over. You're kicking me out? I'm managing a crisis, Richard corrected. Now, sign the papers. It authorizes me to manage our joint assets while you're incapacitated. Thomas stepped forward, his large hand clamping down on the envelope before Sarah could even reach for it. She's not signing anything, Thomas said. Richard's face turned red. Excuse me? That is my wife. Those are our assets. You have no business interfering, old man. She's medicated, Thomas said, his voice steady. She's under duress, and she's not signing a damn thing until a lawyer looks at it. A lawyer that isn't on your payroll. Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. A lawyer? With what money, Thomas? You going to pay for a retainer with your pension? Sarah doesn't have a dime that isn't mine. If she doesn't sign this, I freeze the accounts. I stop paying the mortgage on your little house in the country. Did you forget I own the note on that, too? It was a low blow. Years ago, when Thomas's wife got sick, Richard had offered to buy Thomas's house and lease it back to him to help with medical bills. It was a leverage play Richard had been holding in his back pocket for 5 years. Sarah looked at her father, panic rising. Dad, don't! He'll do it! He'll throw you out! Thomas looked at Richard. He saw the arrogance, the smug certainty that money could buy obedience. He saw a man who thought he was a god because he wore a Rolex. Do it, Thomas said softly. Richard blinked. What? Freeze the accounts, foreclose on my house, Thomas said, leaning in close enough that Richard had to step back. But she isn't signing that paper today. Richard clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Sarah and Thomas. He sensed a shift. He didn't like shifts. He liked control. Fine, Richard spat. He snatched the envelope back. You have 24 hours, Sarah. If you don't sign this by tomorrow morning, I'm cutting you off. And when that baby comes, I'll have social services take it so fast your head will spin. I'll prove you're mentally unstable, and I'll have plenty of witnesses. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the glass pane rattled. Sarah dissolved into sobs, burying her face in her hands. Dad, what have you done? We can't fight him. He's too powerful. Thomas turned to his daughter. The look on his face had changed. The weary, beaten-down look was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating resolve that Sarah hadn't seen since he was a union rep during the steel strikes of the 90s. He's not powerful, Sarah, Thomas said, reaching for his coat. He's just loud, and loud men always make mistakes. Where are you going? Sarah asked, terrified. I have some errands to run, Thomas said, checking his pocket to ensure the recording was safe. You rest. The nurses know not to let him or Jessica back in without calling security. I spoke to the charge nurse while you were sleeping. I told her he threatened you. She's on our side. Dad, please be careful, Sarah wept. Careful got us here, Thomas muttered as he opened the door. It's time to be something else. Thomas didn't go home. He didn't go to a lawyer. He drove his battered 2012 Ford F-150 straight to the wealthy enclave of Bellevue, where Richard and Sarah lived in a sprawling, modern mansion that looked more like a museum than a home. He knew Richard wouldn't be there. Richard would be at the Sterling Hart offices, doing damage control with Jessica, spinning their narrative. They wouldn't expect Thomas to go on the offensive. They thought he was just a dumb factory worker who would go home and cry about his mortgage. Thomas pulled into the driveway. He didn't have a key to the front door. Richard had changed the locks months ago for security, but he knew the code to the garage keypad. Sarah had given it to him so he could drop off a crib he had built by hand, a crib Richard had immediately relegated to the basement because it didn't match the aesthetic. Thomas punched in the code, 08145. Sarah's birthday. The door groaned and rolled up. The house was silent. It smelled of lemon polish and emptiness. Thomas wiped his boots on the mat. He was still a man of manners after all, and entered the mudroom. He moved with a surprising stealth for a big man, his senses on high alert. He wasn't here to steal. He was here to find out why Richard was so desperate for Sarah to sign those papers now. Why the urgency? If Richard was leaving her for Jessica, he could just file for divorce. Why the temporary separation agreement? Why the power of attorney over assets? Why threaten a pregnant woman with a belt to ensure silence? It was overkill. It smacked of desperation. Thomas went straight to Richard's home office on the second floor. It was a glass-walled room overlooking the lake, filled with mahogany furniture and self-aggrandizing awards. The desk was immaculate, too immaculate. Thomas sat in Richard's leather chair. He tried the computer. Password protected, of course. He opened the desk drawers. Pens, stationery, a bottle of scotch. Nothing incriminating. Think like a rat, Thomas whispered to himself. Where does a rat hide his cheese? He looked around the room. There was a large bookshelf filled with business books that looked like they had never been opened. Thomas walked over to it. He pulled out a few books. Nothing. Then he noticed something. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of oversized art encyclopedias, there was a small, grey metal box. It wasn't a safe, just a fireproof lockbox. Thomas pulled it out. It was locked with a key. Thomas didn't have the key, but he did have a multi-tool in his pocket and 30 years of experience fixing jammed machinery. He jammed a flathead screwdriver into the cheap lock mechanism and twisted with brute force. The metal groaned and popped open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or diamonds. There were just file folders. Thomas opened the first one. It was a bank statement. But not for Richard Jenkins. It was for Sarah Jenkins Consulting LLC. Thomas frowned. Sarah didn't have a consulting company. She had been a kindergarten teacher before the pregnancy complications. He scanned the statement. Deposit, $450,000, Sterling Hart Logistics. Withdrawal, $150,000, Cayman Holdings Limited. Withdrawal, $200,000, JS Private Account, JS Jessica Sterling. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He opened the next folder. Tax returns, all filed under Sarah's name, showing millions of dollars in income she never saw and millions of dollars in losses that were being written off. He flipped through more pages, emails printed out. From richard.jenkins.estelinghardt.com to jessica.sterling.estelinghardt.com. Subject, the audit. The IRS is sniffing around the logistics fund. We need to move the debt to the shell company ASAP. Sarah is the sole signatory on the LLC. If this blows up, she takes the fall. We need her to sign the power of attorney so we can backdate the transfers. Once the debt is pinned on her, we file for divorce. She goes to prison for embezzlement. We keep the clean assets. Thomas's hands shook. It wasn't just adultery. It wasn't just abuse. It was a setup, a masterclass in corporate framing. They had been using Sarah's identity for years, likely forging her signature to siphon money out of Jessica's father's company. They were stealing from the company, hiding the money in offshore accounts, and leaving Sarah holding the bag for the missing millions. If Sarah signed that paper Richard gave her this morning, she would be authorizing them to finalize the frame job. She would be signing her own arrest warrant. "You sick sons of bitches!" Thomas hissed. He pulled out his phone and took photos of every single document. He photographed the bank statements, the emails, the forged signatures. He made sure every image was clear. As he was photographing the last page, he heard a sound. The front door downstairs opened. "I'm telling you, I left the separation papers here." Richard's voice floated up the stairs. "I need to grab the original copy before I go back to the hospital." "Just hurry up," Jessica's voice replied. "My dad is asking questions about the quarterly report." Thomas froze. He was trapped on the second floor. There was only one staircase. He shoveled the papers back into the lockbox, but the lock was broken. He couldn't put it back without it looking tampered with. He made a split-second decision. He shoved the most damning documents, the emails and the bank statements showing the transfers to Jessica, under his flannel shirt, tucked tight against his stomach. He shoved the box back behind the books. He looked around for an exit. The window? It was a 20-foot drop to a concrete patio. Steps thudded on the stairs. Richard was coming up. Thomas spotted the closet in the corner of the office. It was a shallow coat closet. It was a cliché, a desperate move, but he had no choice. He stepped inside, pulling the door shut just as Richard walked into the office. Through the slats in the closet door, Thomas watched. Richard walked to the desk, muttering to himself. He opened a drawer, rummaged around. "Where the hell is it?" Jessica walked in behind him. She looked agitated. "Richard, if Sarah doesn't sign that power of attorney, we can't offload the toxic assets. The audit starts in 3 days." "I know," Richard snapped. "I'm working on it. The old man is in the way. He's suspicious." "Then get rid of him," Jessica said coldly. "Plant drugs in his truck. Call the cops. I don't care. Just get him away from her so I can force her to sign." Thomas gripped the handle of the closet door from the inside, his knuckles white. Plant drugs? These people had no bottom. "I found it," Richard said, pulling a file from his briefcase, which he had apparently left on the chair. "Okay, let's go. We need to get back to the hospital before visiting hours end. I'm going to tell Sarah that if she signs, I'll pay off her father's mortgage immediately. That should buy her cooperation." "And if she still refuses?" Jessica asked. Richard paused. He looked out the window, staring right at the spot where Thomas's truck would have been if he hadn't parked it down the street to avoid being seen. "Then we take the gloves off," Richard said, darker than before. "We induce labor. Complications happen. If she dies in childbirth, the debt dies with her estate, and we still get the money." Thomas almost kicked the door open right then and there to strangle him. The rage was a physical thing, a hot iron in his gut. If she dies, they weren't just thieves. They were willing to be murderers. Richard and Jessica turned and left the room. Thomas waited, counting the heartbeats thumping in his ears. He heard their footsteps fade. He heard the front door close. He heard Richard's Porsche rev and peel out of the driveway. Thomas stumbled out of the closet, sweat pouring down his face. He felt sick. He felt terrified. But mostly, he felt a surge of adrenaline. They had made a mistake. They had underestimated the old man. Thomas pulled the stolen documents out of his shirt. He looked at them, his hand steady now. "You want to play dirty?" Thomas whispered to the empty room. "Okay, Richard. Let's play." He didn't go back to the hospital immediately. He knew he needed reinforcements. He needed someone who understood the law, someone who wasn't afraid of Sterling Hart. He needed the bulldog. Thomas walked out of the house, locking the garage behind him. He got into his truck and dialed a number he hadn't called in 10 years. "Frank?" Thomas said when the line connected. "It's Thomas O'Malley. Yeah, I know it's been a while. Look, I need a favor. A big one. Are you still practicing criminal law? Good. Meet me at the diner on 4th. And Frank, bring a audio recorder and maybe a bodyguard. The war had just begun, and Thomas was bringing the heavy artillery. The diner on 4th Street was a relic of a bygone era, a place where the coffee was strong enough to strip paint and the vinyl booths were patched with duct tape. It was the kind of place where men like Thomas O'Malley felt at home, and men like Richard Jenkins wouldn't be caught dead. Frank the Bulldog Marino sat opposite Thomas, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Frank was 70, balding, and wore a suit that was 10 years out of style, but his mind was as sharp as a razor. He had represented Thomas's union for 30 years, burying corporate lawyers under mountains of paperwork and precedent. Frank tapped the stack of photos on the table. You know what this is, Tom? Theft, Thomas said, stirring his black coffee. It's more than theft, Frank corrected, his voice low. This is RICO territory, racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud. And if what you heard in that closet is true, about them wanting Sarah to die in childbirth, it's conspiracy to commit murder. They're setting your daughter up as the fall guy for an embezzlement scheme that looks to be in the ballpark of $5 million. Thomas's hand clenched around his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. Richard said they're coming back tonight. They want her to sign the power of attorney. If she signs that, she admits guilt for the shell company, doesn't she? Essentially, Frank nodded. She validates the existence of the company and takes responsibility for the assets, which are actually debts. Richard and Jessica walk away clean with the cash they siphoned, and Sarah goes to federal prison for a decade. Or worse, she dies, and the investigation dies with her. I won't let her sign, Thomas said. No, Frank smiled, a grim, predatory expression that explained his nickname. She has to sign. Thomas blinked. What? If we go to the cops now with just photos of documents, Richard claims they're forgeries. He claims you're a disgruntled father-in-law. He has high-priced lawyers who will bury this in discovery for years, Frank explained, leaning in over his pancakes. To nail a guy like Richard, you can't just show the gun. You have to catch him pulling the trigger. You want me to use my daughter as bait? Thomas asked, his voice rising dangerously. I want you to trap a rat, Frank said calmly. We need a confession. We need him to state, on record, why she is signing it. We need him to admit the scheme when he thinks he's safe. And then we drop the hammer. Frank pulled a small black device from his pocket. It looked like a car key fob. This is a localized transmitter, Frank said. High fidelity. I'll be in the van in the parking lot recording everything. But we need a witness that Richard can't discredit. A witness that Richard fears. Thomas looked at the device, then out the rain-streaked window. He thought about Sarah, hooked up to machines, terrified and alone. He thought about the belt striking her skin. He thought about the grandson he hadn't met yet. I know a witness, Thomas said, a cold realization dawning on him. The only man Richard fears. Who? Arthur Sterling, Thomas said. Jessica's father, the CEO they're stealing from. Frank raised an eyebrow. That's a Hail Mary, Tom. You think the CEO is going to believe a factory worker over his own daughter and his VP? Arthur Sterling is a hard man, Thomas said, standing up and throwing a $20 bill on the table. But he built that company from the ground up. He hates thieves more than he loves his family. I met him once, at the company picnic years ago. He looked me in the eye and shook my hand. He respects grit. I'm going to call him. And if he doesn't come? Frank asked. Then I kill Richard myself, Thomas said simply. Back at the hospital, The atmosphere was suffocating. Sarah's blood pressure had spiked again, 170 over 110. The doctors were discussing an emergency C-section if it went any higher. She was on magnesium sulfate now to prevent seizures, which made her feel hot, flushed, and foggy. Thomas entered the room quietly. He looked at his daughter. She looked so small in the bed. "Dad?" She slurred slightly, the medication taking its toll. "Did you find a lawyer?" "I did," Thomas said, pulling a chair close to her ear. "Listen to me, Sarah. I need you to do something very hard. I need you to trust me more than you've ever trusted anyone." He explained the plan. He told her about the stolen money. He told her about the conversation in the closet, leaving out the part about them wanting her to die, to spare her the panic. He told her she had to pretend to give up. "You want me to let them win?" Sarah whispered, tears leaking from her eyes. "I want you to lure them into the kill zone," Thomas whispered back, kissing her forehead. "Richard is coming at 7 or so p.m. I need you to cry. I need you to beg. And then I need you to pick up the pen." Sarah nodded, her jaw setting with a surprising strength. "He hit me with a belt, Dad. He let her do it." "I know," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "And tonight, he pays for every mark." Thomas stepped out into the hallway. He took a deep breath and dialed the number for Sterling Hart Logistics. He navigated the automated menu until he reached the executive assistant line. "Mr. Sterling's office," a crisp voice answered. "My name is Thomas O'Malley," Thomas said, his voice commanding. "I am Sarah Jenkins' father. I have evidence that Richard Jenkins and Jessica Sterling are embezzling millions from your company. I'm at St. Jude's Hospital, room 402. They are arriving at 7 p.m. to finalize the fraud. If Mr. Sterling wants to save his company, he needs to be in that room. If not, I go to the press at 8 p.m. He hung up before the assistant could argue. It was the biggest bluff of his life. He didn't have the press. He barely had a plan. But he had the truth. Now he just had to wait. 7 p.m. arrived with the punctuality of a funeral procession. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, humid silence over the city. Inside room 402, the lights were dimmed. Sarah lay propped up on pillows, looking every bit the broken victim Richard wanted her to be. Thomas stood by the window, staring at the parking lot, his silhouette framed by the city lights. The door opened. Richard walked in first, wearing a fresh navy suit, projecting an aura of triumph. Jessica followed, wearing a white dress that looked innocent, but cost a fortune. Behind them trailed a short, nervous-looking man with a briefcase, the notary. "Good evening," Richard said, his voice smooth. "I see you're both still here. Good, let's make this quick." Sarah looks tired. "She is tired," Thomas said, not turning around. "She's ready to sign, Richard. We want it over with." Richard exchanged a smirk with Jessica. The old man had folded. Money always won. "Excellent," Richard said. He snapped his fingers, and the notary scurried forward, placing the documents on the tray table over Sarah's lap. "It's standard procedure, Sarah. Power of attorney. It just lets me handle the bills and the investments while you recover." Sarah looked at the papers. Her hands trembled, partly from the magnesium, partly from rage. "And the house?" she asked, her voice weak. "You promised to pay off Dad's mortgage." "I have the check right here," Richard said, patting his pocket. "Signed and ready. As soon as you sign, your dad is debt-free." "And the baby?" Sarah asked. "You won't take him?" Jessica stepped forward, resting a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Oh, honey, we don't want to take the baby. We just want you to get well. Richard and I will help co-parent, of course. Once you're stable." The cruelty was veiled but sharp. Once you're stable meant never. Thomas turned around slowly. He looked old, defeated. He walked over to the bed. "Go ahead, Sarah. Sign it. We don't have a choice." Richard beamed. "Smart man, Thomas." Sarah picked up the pen. She hovered it over the signature line. "Wait," Thomas said suddenly. Richard's smile faltered. "What now?" Thomas looked Richard dead in the eye. "I just want to be clear. Once she signs this, she takes full responsibility for Sarah Jenkins Consulting LLC, right? All the assets? All the liabilities?" Yes, legalese, Thomas. It's all hers," Richard said impatiently. "Just sign the damn paper." "And the transactions?" Thomas pressed, moving slightly closer to the bedside table where Frank's hidden key fob was taped underneath. "The transfers to the Cayman accounts? She's accepting those too?" The room went deadly silent. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about Cayman accounts?" "I saw the mail." Thomas lied. "I just want to make sure my daughter isn't signing up for debt." Jessica laughed, a nervous titter. "It's profit, you old fool. It's tax optimization. Sarah is going to be rich. Just sign it." "So, the $5 million moved last week was profit?" Thomas asked. Richard stepped forward, his face darkening. "You've been snooping. It doesn't matter. Yes, it's profit. Yes, it's hers. If she doesn't sign, I burn your house down, Thomas. I ruin her. I take the kid. Do you understand? Sign the paper, or I destroy this family." "I think that's clear enough." A deep, baritone voice boomed from the bathroom door. Richard and Jessica spun around so fast that Jessica nearly tripped in her heels. Standing in the doorway of the ensuite bathroom was Arthur Sterling. The CEO of Sterling Hart Logistics was a giant of a man, even in his late 60s. He had silver hair, eyes like flint, and a presence that sucked the oxygen out of the room. He had entered through the adjoining room's connecting door, arranged by the charge nurse at Thomas's request, 10 minutes prior. He had heard everything. Jessica's face went white. "Daddy?" Richard looked like he had been punched in the gut. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Arthur Sterling walked into the room. He didn't look at Richard. He looked straight at his daughter. "Tax optimization?" Arthur asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Is that what we're calling embezzlement now, Jessica?" "Daddy, no, it's not," Jessica stammered, reaching out. "This old man, he's lying. He's manipulating you." "I heard you," Arthur roared, making everyone flinch. "I heard you threaten a pregnant woman. I heard you admit to the Cayman transfers. I've been wondering where the liquidity in the logistics fund went. I thought it was the market. But it was you. My own flesh and blood." He turned to Richard. The look of disgust on his face was absolute. "And you," Arthur spat. "I brought you into my home. I gave you a career. And you repay me by stealing from me and beating your wife." "I never touched her," Richard protested, raising his hands. "She's crazy. She's hormonal." "He did," Sarah spoke up, her voice suddenly strong. She pulled up the sleeve of her gown. The purple, yellow, and black bruise from the belt was gruesome against her pale skin. And Jessica did it, with her belt, while Richard laughed about it on the phone. Arthur looked at the bruise. He looked at the belt Jessica was still wearing. The silver buckle matched the shape of the welts perfectly. Arthur Sterling closed his eyes for a moment, a pained expression crossing his face. When he opened them, the father was gone. Only the CEO remained. "You're fired," Arthur said to Richard, "effective immediately. You will be escorted from the building by security. You are barred from company property." "You can't do that!" Richard screamed, his composure shattering. "I know where the bodies are buried, Arthur. You fire me, I take the company down." "You won't have time," Thomas interrupted. Thomas walked to the door of the hospital room and opened it. Frank Marino stood there. Beside him were 2 uniformed police officers and a detective in a cheap suit. "Richard Jenkins, Jessica Sterling," the detective said, stepping into the crowded room. "I'm Detective Miller, Seattle PD, Financial Crimes Division. We received a packet of evidence this afternoon regarding wire fraud and identity theft, and we just heard a very interesting conversation via a live wire." Richard looked at the notary. The notary dropped the briefcase and bolted out the door, knocking over a nurse in the hallway. "It's a set-up," Jessica shrieked as the officer approached her. "Daddy, do something! They're arresting me!" Arthur turned his back on his daughter. He walked over to Sarah's bedside. "I am sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I raised a monster. I will pay for everything. The hospital, the baby, everything." "Daddy!" Jessica screamed as the officer cuffed her hands behind her back, the same hands that had wielded the belt only yesterday. Richard tried to run. He lunged for the gap between Thomas and the door, but Thomas was ready. As Richard tried to shove past, Thomas didn't step aside. He stepped in. He planted his feet, wound up his right arm, heavy with 40 years of manual labor, and connected a hook to Richard's jaw that sounded like a gunshot. Richard's feet left the floor. He crumpled into a heap of expensive wool and failure. Thomas shook his hand, wincing slightly. "That," Thomas said, looking down at his son-in-law, "was for the belt." The police dragged a dazed Richard and a sobbing Jessica out of the room. The hallway filled with the commotion of the arrest, the flashing of radios, and the stares of curious nurses. Inside room 402, silence returned. Sarah began to cry, but they were tears of relief. The monster was gone. The cage was open. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and held his daughter. He was tired, he was old. But he had won. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, burying her face in his flannel shirt. "It's over, Bear," Thomas whispered. "It's all over." But as the adrenaline faded, the monitors began to beep again. Faster, more urgent. Beep, 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 beep. Sarah gasped, clutching her stomach. "Dad, something's wrong. It hurts. It really hurts." The stress of the confrontation had been too much. The adrenaline dump had triggered the one thing they were trying to avoid. The monitors shrieked a continuous red alert. A seizure. "Nurse!" Thomas screamed, panic seizing his heart again. "Help! Something's wrong!" Doctors swarmed the room. "Code Blue! She's seizing! Get the crash cart! Prep the OR for emergency C-section! Stat!" Thomas was shoved back against the wall as the medical team took over. He watched them wheel Sarah's bed out of the room at a run. "Save her!" Thomas yelled after them. "Please, just save her!" He stood alone in the empty room, the scattered papers of the power of attorney lying on the floor like trash. He had defeated the villains, but the cost might have been too high. The real fight, the fight for life, was just beginning. The hallway outside the operating room was a purgatory of white walls and fluorescent hums. Time didn't move in a straight line here. It was measured only by the erratic thumping of Thomas O'Malley's heart. Beside him sat Arthur Sterling. The billionaire CEO looked out of place in the plastic chair, his tailored suit rumpled. He hadn't left. He had sent his lawyers to handle the police, but he stayed for the woman his daughter had tormented. "She's a fighter, Thomas," Arthur said softly. "If she has half your grit, she'll pull through." The double doors swung open. A surgeon in blue scrubs stepped out. Thomas was on his feet instantly. "She's stable," the surgeon said, pulling down his mask. Thomas felt his knees buckle with relief, Arthur reaching out to steady him. It was close, a placental abruption. But the baby, it's a boy. 4 pounds, 6 ounces. He's in the NICU, but he came out kicking. Thomas let out a sob. a raw sound of pure release. Hours later, Sarah woke to the rhythmic, calm beeping of a monitor. The room was dim, the rain against the window no longer threatening, but cleansing. "Dad!" she rasped. Thomas was there instantly. "I'm here, Bear. The baby is fine. He's beautiful." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "And Richard?" "Gone," Thomas said, his voice hard. "Locked up. No bail. And Jessica is in the cell next to him. Arthur didn't protect her." Sarah closed her eyes, the nightmare finally dissolving. "I named him," she whispered. "Thomas. Tom for short. Because he's going to be strong like his grandpa." Thomas froze, his heart swelling until he thought it might burst. He kissed her forehead, weeping silently. 3 months later, the King County Courthouse was packed. The Sterling Hart scandal had dominated the news, but the courtroom went silent as Richard and Jessica were led in. They looked nothing like the polished predators of room 402. Richard was gaunt. Jessica looked like a frightened child. Frank the bulldog merino dismantled them. He played the audio from the hospital room and displayed the forged financial documents. But the nail in the coffin was their own greed. "It was her idea," Richard screamed during cross-examination. "She threatened to fire me if I didn't help her steal from her father." "Liar!" Jessica shrieked back. "He seduced me. He used me to pay off his debts." The illusion of their love evaporated, replaced by the desperate clawing of rats on a sinking ship. The verdict took less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern woman, looked over her glasses at Richard. "Mr. Jenkins, you preyed on a pregnant woman and plotted to leave her destitute or dead. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." She turned to Jessica. "And you, Ms. Sterling, for your cruelty and theft, are sentenced to 10 years. As the bailiffs hauled them away, Richard looked back at the gallery. He locked eyes with Sarah, who sat holding baby Tom. She didn't look away. She just held her son tighter. She had won. 6 months later, the summer sun set over the O'Malley house. It was a modest home, but it was fully paid off, courtesy of Richard's liquidated assets. Thomas sat on the porch, watching Sarah rock baby Tom. A black car pulled up, and Arthur Sterling stepped out, carrying a box of pastries. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He had stepped down to focus on ethics and, surprisingly, being a grandfather figure. "He's getting big," Arthur said, taking a seat. "I finalized the trust fund today. For his education." "Thank you, Arthur." Sarah smiled. Thomas took a sip of lemonade, looking at the scene. The fear that had consumed him in that hospital room felt like a lifetime ago. "You know," Thomas said, leaning back, "they thought money gave them power. They thought they could break us." Sarah reached over and squeezed her father's hand. "They forgot one thing, Dad. Family isn't about whose name is on the building. It's about who shows up when the storm hits." Thomas smiled, watching a firefly flicker to life in the dusk. "Yeah," he whispered. "We showed up." And that is the story of how a father's intuition and a mother's resilience brought down an empire of greed. Richard and Jessica thought they were untouchable, but they underestimated the most dangerous force on earth, a parent protecting their child. It's a chilling reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, is always watching. What would you have done if you were Thomas? Would you have waited for the police or taken matters into your own hands sooner? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more true-to-life dramas about justice and redemption, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay safe.